They say ghosts don't cast shadows. But Wyatt Cole did. A long, lonely one that stretched across the prairie like a man who once mattered and stopped trying. For 3 years, no one called his name. No one knocked on his door. Until one morning, a rider appeared on the ridge. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just watched him, like she already knew what he feared the most. That he'd been trying to disappear, and she saw him anyway. Wyatt Cole hadn't spoken to another soul in over 1,000 days. He wasn't mute, just done with the world. Out here on the edge of nowhere, he didn't have to explain his silence. The wind didn't ask questions. The chickens didn't judge. The horses never brought up the past. He fixed fences that weren't broken, talked to his mule more than he talked to himself. And at night, he laid awake staring at the rafters of a cabin he never quite made a home. Whatever life he'd had before, he'd buried it in the soil, alongside a name he stopped saying out loud. But that morning, spring biting at the edge of winter, something changed. He was out checking the fence line in the east pasture, sun barely over the hills, when he saw her. 50 yards off, a woman on horseback sat motionless atop the ridge, the kind of still that didn't ask permission, the kind that said, "I've been watching." Her horse grazed, reins slack in her hand. She wasn't here to pass through. She wasn't lost, and she sure as hell wasn't afraid. Wyatt froze. His hand gripped the fence post like it might hold him steady, the hammer in his other hand useless. He knew every face from town, kept his distance, but he knew them. This woman? She wasn't one of them. Her buckskin fringe caught the morning sun. Her saddle didn't creak. Her eyes never left him. Apache. Not a guess. He knew it, the way a man knows when he's being hunted. He looked down, pretended to inspect the post, hoped she'd ride off. But when he glanced back, she was closer. 20 yards now, then 10. She didn't speak right away, just studied him. His face, his hands, his silence. The kind of look that sees what's broken before you admit it's there. And then, clear as water in a desert creek, she said, "I want a child from you." Wyatt Cole felt the world tilt sideways. His jaw opened. No sound came. The hammer slipped from his fingers. Thud. She didn't smile, didn't flinch, just sat tall in the saddle, like she'd asked the price of corn feed, like it wasn't the most unsettling sentence he'd ever heard in his life. His brain scrambled. Who was she? What did she want? Why him? He managed a weak shake of the head, more reflex than answer. She tilted hers, unbothered. "You live alone," she said. "Don't go to town unless you have to. No wife, no children. You don't speak unless it's to yourself or the mule." Wyatt's spine stiffened. She'd been watching. Not just today, not just yesterday. Days, maybe longer. Then, in one smooth, fluid motion, she dismounted. Her boots whispered on the dust. Now they were eye to eye. She took a step forward. He backed into the fence post. "I'm not asking for your understanding," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'm telling you what I need. You can say no. But know this. I chose you, and I don't choose lightly." Her hand rose, not threatening, not demanding, just gentle. She touched his forearm, warm skin against weathered skin. For a second, he forgot to breathe, and then, just as quickly, she turned. Mounted her horse, spoke only once more. "I'll come back tomorrow. Think on it." Then she rode off, leaving him standing alone beneath a sky suddenly too wide, too quiet. He didn't sleep that night, didn't eat much the next morning either. But at sunrise, when he looked out to that same ridge, she was there. Waiting. Call to action. If that got your heart beating and your boots itching to move, Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now. The wind's just shifting, and Wyatt Cole's story is only beginning. The next morning, Wyatt Cole stepped out into a sky the color of hammered pewter. A stiff wind swept across the high plains, stirring dust and dry grass. But it wasn't the weather that made his hands shake as he poured feed into the trough. It was knowing, somehow, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that she would return. And she did. Same ridge, same stillness, her silhouette cut against the dull horizon like a carving in obsidian, unmoving, watching. Wyatt's chest went tight. He tried to pretend he didn't see her, kept his head low, busying his hands with a feed bucket that didn't need filling. But the weight of her gaze was like heat from a stove. It couldn't be ignored for long. He stole a glance. Closer now, maybe 30 yards. Her horse walked slow, deliberate, like her presence wasn't a question, like she was part of the land and had every right to be there. Wyatt straightened, his spine stiff, jaw set. He wanted to feel defiant. Instead, he just felt exposed. She stopped 10 paces out and dismounted. No greeting, no explanation. Just those sharp, calm eyes on him like he was a puzzle she already knew how to solve. "I told you I'd be back," she said. Wyatt nodded, though he wasn't sure why. His throat was dry as old kindling. "Niol," he said, remembering the name. It tasted strange on his tongue, foreign and firm. Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "You remembered." "Hard name to forget," he muttered, then instantly regretted saying it, fearing it might sound like a joke. But Niol didn't take offense. She just stepped closer, boots crunching dry earth. "I don't come from softness," she said, voice low and steady. "Where I'm from, the ones who shout the loudest are often followed. Not because they're right, just because they're loud." Wyatt looked away, squinting toward the fence line. He didn't like the way her words sunk under his skin. "You don't shout," she said. "You listen. You move slow. You treat your animals like kin, not tools. I watched. Long enough to be sure." "How long?" Wyatt asked. His voice was quiet, hoarse. 5 days. He turned toward her, brow furrowed. "Why?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Because I can't choose wrong. I can't give life to something and hand it to a man who'll crush it like dry leaves under his heel. You carry your silence like armor. But I see what's under it." Wyatt swallowed hard. The wind tugged at his coat. He didn't speak. Couldn't. His body was stone, but inside the foundation was cracking. Niol stepped forward again, slow and respectful, not pressing, just present. "My people are dwindling," she said. "Our blood thins with every passing winter. I need a child, not just to carry my blood, but to carry my memory, my way. But I won't pass those things to someone who doesn't know how to hold them gentle." Her voice didn't plead. It declared, firm, grounded. Wyatt finally met her eyes. "You don't know me." "I know enough," she said. "Enough to believe you're the right kind of different." Then she turned to go, but paused. "I'll wait on the ridge, until sundown. You don't have to come. But if you do, it'll mean you're not saying no." With that, she mounted her horse in one graceful motion and rode back to the crest, her silhouette framed by the open sky like some ancient truth carved into stone. Wyatt stood frozen long after she disappeared. The wind moved around him, but inside he was still. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like protection. It felt like a test. The sun drifted low, hanging like an old coin in the sky, casting long shadows that spilled over the prairie like spilled ink. Wyatt Cole had worked through the day, like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts, hauling water, checking fence lines that didn't need checking, splitting wood he didn't need. But the weight of Niol's words pressed heavier than any chore. If you come to the ridge before sundown, it means you're not saying no. By the time the light turned amber, Wyatt stood at the bottom of the slope, hat in hand, dust on his boots. He didn't remember deciding to walk there. His body had just moved, as if pulled. Niol was waiting. She sat cross-legged beside a small fire, her horse tied to a mesquite tree behind her. Her silhouette was still and proud, framed by the falling sun like something older than the land itself. She didn't speak as Wyatt crested the hill, just looked up, steady as ever, and patted the ground beside her. He hesitated, then sat, awkward, stiff, like a man who hadn't shared space with another soul in years, which was true. "You came," she said. "I reckon I did," Wyatt murmured. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighty, like the calm before a thunderclap. Then Niol turned to him, her voice low and steady. "I want a child," she said. "From you." Same words as before. No blush, no hesitance, no flinch. Wyatt's breath caught. Hearing it the second time didn't soften the blow. It landed hard, square in his chest. "I figured I misheard yesterday," he said. "You didn't." He stared at the fire, its flames crackling soft as wind through dry grass. "You sure you got the right man?" "I watched you for 5 days," she answered. "Watched how you treat your animals, watched how you move slow when others rush, how you fix what's broken instead of throwing it aside." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't try to convince him, just told him what she'd seen. "I'm not looking for strength the way most people define it," she added. "I've known loud men with fists and tempers. They burn hot and quick. I don't want that." Wyatt's hands fidgeted in the dirt, calloused fingers plucking at grass roots. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," she said again, "and I don't have time to waste on men who shout and stomp to prove they exist. You're still, you're quiet, but not hollow. You endure." He looked at her then, really looked. Her jaw was set, but her eyes held something he hadn't noticed before. Fear, not of him, of what she was risking. "You need more than a quiet man," Wyatt said, voice rough. "You need a partner, a protector. I ain't been either." "No," she said softly. "But you could be." That stopped him cold. The way she said it, like she believed it. She reached into a leather pouch and placed something between them. A small carved figure, an eagle worn from years of touch. "This belonged to my father," she said. "He taught me to watch for the quiet ones, said wind that whistles too loud forgets to listen. But the eagle, he listens before he strikes." Wyatt stared at the carving, then at her. "I ain't saying yes," he whispered. "I know," she said, "but I ain't saying no either." Niol gave a small nod, her expression unreadable, but something in her shoulders loosened. "I'll wait for your answer," she said. 3 more sunrises. That's all I can spare." They sat in silence again. 2 souls stitched together by uncertainty and something that felt almost like hope. When Wyatt rose to leave, she didn't stop him. But her words followed him down the ridge, sticking harder than burrs to denim. "I don't need perfect. I need willing." Wyatt didn't sleep. Not that night. Not with her words echoing like hoofbeats through his chest. "I don't need perfect. I need willing." He lay awake in that narrow bed, eyes fixed to the rafters, arms across his chest like a man bracing for lightning. Every breath scraped. Every thought circled the same flame. A child, her child, with him. The weight of it pressed like a boulder on his ribs. He wasn't built for fatherhood. Hell, he wasn't even sure he remembered how to be someone's friend. He'd spent 3 years sanding down his edges, so no one would get close enough to bleed on them. But Niall hadn't asked for ease. She'd asked for a kind of strength Wyatt had spent most of his life pretending he didn't want. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. Or thought he had. He found her out by the old cottonwood, just past the fence line, sitting cross-legged in the dirt like it was church. No fire, no movement, just sky above, earth below, and that stillness she carried like armor. She didn't look at him when he approached. Didn't have to. She knew he was there. "I've got my answer," Wyatt said, throat raw. She turned her head slightly, waiting. "It's no," he said. "Not because I think you're wrong, but because I think you're right. And I ain't that man." Silence. Not surprised? Not angry? Just silence. Wyatt cleared his throat. "I ain't the kind of strong you need. You want someone who'll raise a child with fire and grit. Someone who'll keep their name alive after you're gone. I've been hiding so long I forgot how to carry my own." Still no response. Then, finally, she stood, slow and calm, and turned to face him. "You're wrong," she said, voice even. "About what?" "About what kind of strong I need." Wyatt blinked. She stepped closer, eyes steady as granite. "My people are full of fire. Men who burn hot, loud, quick to draw, quicker to wound. We've had 100 years of that kind of strong, and it's killing us." Her words landed like hammers. "I didn't choose you despite your silence, Wyatt Cole," she said. "I chose you because of it." He felt something crack inside, small but deep. "My father, Taza, he wasn't a warrior. He was a listener, a seed planter. He believed strength wasn't in the arm, but in the patience to wait for what grows." She stepped closer still. "He raised me different, taught me to look for men who don't fight to be seen. Men who do what's right even when no one's watching. Men who listen. Men who endure." Wyatt swallowed hard. "You saw all that in me?" "I did." He looked down at his hands, calloused, dirty, shaking. "I don't feel like a man who endures." "You're here," she said. "That's enough proof." They stood in silence again, but this time it felt different, like a breath held between two storms. Niall reached for him, fingers brushing the side of his wrist. She didn't take his hand. She just let her touch linger, like a question she wasn't forcing him to answer. "I ain't asking you to be someone else," she said. "Just asking if you're done hiding." Wyatt looked up, into eyes that saw more of him than he'd dared show anyone in years. He didn't say yes. Not yet. But he didn't walk away either. The prairie was dead still. No wind, no bird song. Just the heavy quiet that comes before something changes. Wyatt stood by the corral, working a knot in the fence rope that didn't need fixing. His fingers moved, but his mind was elsewhere, on the feel of her touch the night before, the truth in her voice, the way she said, "You endure." It had dug deeper than any insult he'd ever known. Then he heard them. Hoofbeats, not fast, not frantic, just steady, purposeful. He turned and saw them cresting the rise, 3 riders silhouetted against the morning sun. 2 men, 1 woman, all older, all Apache, all watching him like he was already on trial. Niall stepped out from the edge of the barn, her braid swinging over one shoulder, jaw set firm. She'd been waiting. "They came sooner than I thought," she said. Wyatt's gut twisted. "Friends of yours?" "Family," she said, "and judges." The 3 rode in without a word, forming a loose semicircle just short of the fence line. The woman, tall, silver-haired, with skin like old leather and eyes sharp as flint, swung down first. Her gaze cut through the dust and landed on Niall. They spoke in their language, fast and clipped. Neil held her ground, answering evenly. But Wyatt caught the tone. Anger, disappointment, disbelief. Then the woman turned her gaze on him. He hadn't felt so seen in years, and never like this. Her eyes crawled over him, slow and merciless, like she was measuring what kind of man he really was. She said something low to Neil. Neil snapped back. Then, in English, the woman said coldly, "He is weak." Wyatt flinched like he'd been slapped. The men dismounted. One of them, tall, weathered with braided hair and a scar across his chin, nodded at Wyatt but said nothing. The other, younger but with eyes just as hard, folded his arms and waited. "His name is Coda," Neil said, gesturing to the scarred man. "The quiet one is Lenu, and this," she nodded at the woman, "is Tala, my father's sister." Tala stepped forward. "Your father, Taza, was a man of honor, a man of weight, and now you stand beside this." Wyatt opened his mouth to speak, but Neil stepped between them. "I stand beside a man who doesn't shout," she said, "a man who fixes what's broken, who listens more than he talks." Tala scoffed. "That is not strength. That is fear wearing manners." "No," Neil said. "It's the kind of strength we forgot how to recognize. The kind Taza carried every day without needing to prove it." Tala's face changed then. Just a flicker. Something raw. Maybe grief. Maybe memory. But it passed. She looked at Wyatt. "You think you can carry her through a hard winter? Think you can raise a child who belongs to a people not your own?" Wyatt swallowed. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'll learn, and I'll carry what she gives me like it's worth something." Tala studied him a moment longer, then stepped back. She said something in their tongue. Coda and Lenu nodded. The judgment wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. As they turned to leave, Tala spoke once more. "You carry her spirit now. If it breaks, it's on you." Then they rode off, leaving silence in their wake. Neil came to stand beside him, close but not touching. Her voice was soft. "They didn't say yes," she murmured, "but they didn't say no." Wyatt nodded. "That's enough for me." The sky turned the color of bruised bone by mid-afternoon. Clouds bunched thick above the plains, moving like slow cattle with thunder in their bellies. Wyatt Cole could smell the storm before he could see it. Sharp, electric, and mean. He was chopping wood near the shed when Niall rode up hard. Her braid slapped against her back, face set like iron. "Storm's coming fast," she said. Wyatt nodded, already feeling it in his bones. "Been sniffing it since breakfast?" She looked past him at the cabin. His roof, mostly patched, but the west side still sagged with rot. "You haven't fixed it?" she said flatly. "I've been waiting," he said, then corrected himself. "Putting it off." "You can't wait anymore." Wyatt stared at the warped boards above the porch. Wind tugged at the edge like a warning. "I know." She swung off her horse and moved past him, opening the tool shed and dragging out the old ladder without asking. Her hands moved with purpose. Her silence meant business. He followed. Neil shoved the ladder against the cabin wall, then turned and looked at him. Not with pity, not even challenge. Just expectation. "I ain't great with heights," Wyatt admitted. "Neither was my uncle," she replied, "until he had to pull his brother out of a ravine." Her eyes flicked to the roof. "There's no choice here, Wyatt. You either climb, or that roof caves in by nightfall. Your choice is before the storm or during it." He stared at the ladder. His palms already felt slick. "You ain't gonna help?" "I'm helping," she said. I'm steadying the bottom." Wyatt didn't argue. Truth was, he needed her there. He grabbed the boards and a rusted box of nails and started up. Each step felt like its own kind of battle. The ladder swayed with the wind, and every rung creaked under his weight. By the time he reached the edge, his throat was dry and his breath short. The boards were worse than he thought, black with rot, brittle as crackers. He got to work. He tore the old planks free, one by one. Wind clawed at his coat, slapping it against his side. He hammered new boards in place, hands shaking, sweat dripping despite the chill. Below, Niall said nothing. But he felt her there, anchoring the ladder, grounding his fear with her stillness. A gust nearly took him off the edge, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. When he slammed the last nail into place, the first drop of rain hit his hand like a warning shot. He scrambled down fast, boots hitting hard dirt just as the sky opened wide. Thunder cracked overhead. Rain fell in sheets. They ran for the cabin together, soaked in seconds. Inside, the fire crackled weak, but the roof held. No drips, no leaks. Wyatt stood there, dripping, breathing hard. His chest burned, not from the climb, but from something deeper, something like pride, like worth. "You were afraid," Niall said, brushing rain from her face. "Still am," he replied, voice low. "But you climbed anyway." He met her eyes. "That means something to you?" She stepped close, reached out, and pressed her hand to the center of his chest, where his heart still thumped wild. "That's what I needed to see," she said softly. "Not a man without fear. A man who moves anyway." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Then I guess I passed." She smiled, just barely. "You passed the first storm." Outside, thunder rolled toward the distant hills. Inside, for the first time in years, Wyatt Cole stood dry under his own roof, and felt like he might just be standing for something more. The storm raged well past sundown, drumming the roof Wyatt had just patched like it was testing his work. But the ceiling held, dry as bone. Inside, the fire crackled soft, throwing amber light against log walls and damp clothes hung to dry. Wyatt sat on the floor with his back to the hearth, legs stretched out, boots off, socks steaming. Across from him, Niall knelt, arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes fixed on the flames. Neither of them had spoken in over an hour, not because they had nothing to say, because the air between them was full of things too heavy for casual talk. Finally, Niall broke the silence. "I have until the full moon," she said quietly. Wyatt looked up, unsure he'd heard right. "For what?" Her voice was steady, but her fingers fidgeted at the hem of her sleeve. "To choose. Either conceive by then, or marry Matto." Wyatt's chest tightened. The name hung like smoke in the room. "Matto," he said flatly. "That the one they want for you?" Niall nodded. "A warrior, respected, a good hunter." "And loud," Wyatt muttered. That got a faint smile from her. A tired one. "He's like most men I've known," she said. "Strong in the ways that break things." She shifted, folding her legs beneath her. "My mother, Ayita, was given to a man like that. He never raised his hand, but he never listened either. He made her small, day by day, controlled what she wore, how she spoke, who she saw." Wyatt didn't move, didn't speak. Niall's voice lowered. "They say she died of fever, but I watched her disappear long before her body gave up." The fire popped, sending sparks up the flue. "I swore I'd never let that happen to me," she continued. "But now the council thinks it's time to carry bloodlines, time to obey." Her jaw clenched. They don't understand that survival isn't just about bones and breath, it's about spirit. Wyatt's throat worked around a dry swallow. I ain't Matto, he said. I know, she replied, but I'm no one's picture of a strong man either. You stood on that roof, she said. You stood against my aunt's judgment. You didn't flinch when I told you what I wanted. He exhaled slow. I flinched inside. That's not weakness, she said. That's fear, and fear that doesn't stop a man from doing the hard thing. That's the kind of strength I trust. She looked at him then, not the stare she'd given him from horseback, not the measuring look. This one was raw, human. I'm scared too, she whispered. Scared I'm wrong about you. Scared I'm right. Scared I won't know how to be anything other than what I was raised to fear. Wyatt crossed the space between them slowly, not touching her, just close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. I've been scared every day since I buried my brother, he said. Scared I'd fail the land. Scared I'd rot in my own silence. Then you showed up, demanding more from me than I knew I had. She looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't look away. I'm still here, he said. Still listening, still trying. That was all he could promise, but for Neil, it was enough. She leaned forward, her forehead brushing his, breath shared between them. And in that closeness, where no fire could reach, they began to understand what surviving together might feel like. Dawn cracked open over the plains like a slow match to dry kindling. Smoke still curled from the cabin's chimney. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in wet earth and sky the color of a faded bruise. Wyatt Cole stood at the front steps, hat in hand, staring across the quiet land like a man about to step off a cliff. Inside, Niall waited. The fire was down to glowing embers. She hadn't asked him again. She didn't need to. Wyatt had spent the night wrestling with ghosts, his own doubts, his own failings, but somewhere between the wind dying and the fire giving way to coals, he'd made his decision. He turned, walked inside, and found her standing by the window, arms crossed, shoulders tight. I'm not good with speeches, he said. She looked at him, eyes dark and waiting. But if I've learned anything since you rode into my life, it's that some things don't need to be perfect. They just need to be true. He stepped forward, voice steady. My answer's yes. Her lips parted. Surprise flickered across her face, but not disbelief, like she'd braced herself for a storm and instead got sun. But before she could speak, hoofbeats thundered outside. 4 riders crested the far ridge. Niall's face changed. Not fear, readiness. They're early, she muttered, moving to the door. Wyatt followed. The lead rider was unmistakable. Broad-chested, braided hair whipping in the wind, he rode with the kind of certainty Wyatt would never have. Matto. He dismounted before the others even slowed, boots hitting the dirt like they had dominion over it. His eyes locked on Wyatt, and what they held wasn't curiosity. It was contempt. He barked a sentence in Apache at Niall. She answered in kind, calm but firm. Wyatt didn't understand the words, but he caught the fire beneath them. Then Matto's gaze landed on Wyatt again, and he spoke. Slow, guttural English. This is the one? He sneered. This pale stick who hides behind women? Wyatt's heart thumped, but he stood his ground. I don't hide, he said. Matto stepped closer. The space between them crackled. You think you can protect her? He spat. Raise a child among people who don't want you? Niall moved to step between them, but Wyatt reached out and took her hand. Not to stop her. To show her he wasn't backing down. She looked at him, then let their fingers intertwine. I didn't choose him for fists, she said to Matto, loud enough for all to hear. I chose him because he doesn't need them to be strong. That landed like a stone in still water. Matto sneered. He won't last a season. Then let me fail by living, not hiding, Wyatt said. The silence after was heavier than the sky. One of Matto's men shifted in his saddle, restless. The tension begged for blood. But Matto didn't draw. Instead, he stepped back, eyes scanning Wyatt like he wasn't sure what he saw anymore. You made your choice, he told Neil, but choices carry weight. I know, she said. With one last look, sharp, unreadable, Matto turned, mounted, and rode off. The others followed, the dust of their departure slow to settle. Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Neil looked at him. You didn't run. Didn't think it'd help, he muttered. Besides, you were still holding my hand? She didn't smile, but her eyes shone with something quiet and fierce. That was the answer I needed more than any yes. The next morning rode in cold and gray. Clouds hung low, heavy as regret, and the land felt quieter than usual, like even the birds knew something was coming. Wyatt sat on the porch rail with a rifle across his knees. He hadn't slept much. Not out of fear, not anymore. But because he knew this kind of peace never lasted. Neil came out, arms wrapped in a blanket, the wind teasing loose strands of her hair. They'll come again, she said, voice low. He nodded. Maybe today, maybe next week. But Matto ain't the kind to let go easy. She lowered her eyes. He wasn't always like that. Wyatt looked at her, quiet. I believe it, he said. But it don't change what he is now. Inside, the boy was still asleep, curled under Wyatt's old army coat like it was a fortress. For a moment, Wyatt wished he could do the same. Wrap the ones he loved in thick canvas and keep the world out. But the world had a way of finding you. By mid-afternoon, a rider galloped up the trail, hat flapping, coat soaked with sweat and urgency. It was old Merle Stanton from downriver, face ghost-white and voice shaking. Raiders, he rasped. 6 of 'em. 2 farms hit already. Burned stock, took everything. Heading this way. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Apache? Merle shook his head. White men, rough bunch. Might be deserters or drifters, but they ride like they're hunting something specific. He didn't have to say it out loud. They were looking for her. By nightfall, torches glowed like distant fireflies on the horizon. Neil stood in the doorway, arms around the boy, while Wyatt saddled the mare with shaking hands he refused to acknowledge. You should take him, he said. Ride east, cut through the wash, stay low. I'm not leaving you. He stepped forward, dirt-caked boots crunching dry grass. If they get through, you can't be here. Her chin trembled, but she didn't cry. She just looked at him like the earth might split, and she'd still choose to stand beside him. I made my choice too, remember? She whispered. He cupped her cheek. Then you better load the Winchester. They dug in, boarded windows, buckets by the door, ropes knotted, traps set. A plan spoken in few words but loud with meaning. When night finally fell full, the hush was unbearable, the kind of silence that only came before something bad. And when the first shot rang out, close and vicious, it shattered that silence like glass. Wyatt fired back from the porch. Shadows moved fast and wild beyond the tree line. Yells, hooves, curses. A figure rushed the barn. Neil dropped him with one shot to the chest, eyes burning like wildfire. Inside, the boy wailed, and Wyatt felt the weight of everything he had to lose. The fight wasn't clean. It was desperate, teeth clenched, blood-soaked. But they held. By dawn, only smoke rose. 3 bodies lay in the grass. The others had fled. Wyatt stood bleeding from the shoulder, breath ragged. Neil leaned beside him, dirt on her face, hands shaking around a half-spent rifle. "We made it," she whispered. But Wyatt didn't smile. He just looked out toward the hills. "No," he said. "We survived. There's a difference." She looked at him, brow furrowed. "I can feel it. This ain't the end. It's just the edge of the storm." The land was quieter now. Not because the world had grown gentler, but because something had been earned, fought for, protected, and not by the men who once carved names into cedar posts, but by those who rose from ashes and chose to stay. Heartland Ranch stood tall again, weathered fences repaired, cattle grazing steady beneath the wide blue sky. There were still scars, the kind that didn't show up on skin but lingered in how a man looked toward the horizon a beat too long. Wyatt Cole, once a ghost of a man, had carved a life out of regret. Not perfect, not easy, but real. He walked the field slowly that morning, boots brushing the tops of wild grass. Beside him, Neil carried the boy. Hers by blood, his by choice. The little one had her eyes, but when he furrowed his brow, Wyatt swore he saw himself staring back. They reached the ridge just as the sun lifted over the far hills. The earth shimmered gold, soft and forgiving. From here, you could see the whole valley, patched in green and rust and memory. Neil looked out, her voice calm but certain. "He'll never know what you were, only what you became." Wyatt swallowed hard. That's the hope. A wind stirred then, not cold, not biting, but warm, carrying with it the smell of juniper and horses and something older than either of them. She handed him the boy. Wyatt held him close, felt the thump of a small heart. A new heart. One that hadn't seen war or sorrow. One that just wanted to run through open fields and chase dragonflies. The boy pointed to the horizon. "What's that way?" Wyatt's lips tugged into a half-smile. "That? That's where the story ends, or maybe begins again." Down below, the others were gathering. Neighbors, kin, those who had stood when it counted. They were raising a new barn wall today, something simple and steady, built by many hands. Neil placed a stone by the fence post. Smooth, flat, etched with the name of her father and her brother. Beside it, Wyatt set one too. Plain, unmarked, but heavy in meaning. "This place," she whispered, "was never just about cattle. It was about keeping promises." He nodded. "And burying the ghosts we carried here." The 3 of them stood there as the light spread further. The ranch no longer belonged to one man's past. It belonged to the future they'd built with blistered palms and stitched hearts. In the end, the West didn't change for them. It remained wild, brutal, beautiful, but they'd changed for it. And maybe that was enough. So now the land waits. Quiet, open, watching. And the question remains, what will you fight for when no one's watching and the storm comes again?